Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. So, today's video was actually going to be an ASMR video, but two reasons why I kind of like vetoed the idea is one, I already posted an ASMR video earlier this week, so if you're interested in a more like pencil crayon, colored pencil drawing session that's ASMR, you can check out that video. But for today's video, yeah, I'm just gonna do the voiceover on top of the sounds plus music, just because later on I was unable to record with getting consistent noise, if that makes sense. I think at some point, I'm not too sure if it's gonna be that audible for the first half, but the heater kicks on because it's been getting a little cold lately. But then later on in the video as well, it gets super duper windy. You'll probably see it because at some points my camera actually shakes because it feels like the whole building is shaking. But yeah, so today we are drawing Nahida from Genshin Impact. I've been wanting to draw her for a while, and by the time you guys see the video, it's been a couple of days since I've already started this drawing. So I think, yeah, so I did this drawing within 2 different sessions. So I did about 2 hours on the first half and about 2.5 hours on the second half, or 3 hours, let's say 3 hours. Actually, I'm gonna talk about that a little bit later. I'll leave a screenshot at the end. I believe it says 5 hours, so I'm probably gonna say it's 5 hours. But the time lapse says it's like 7 minutes of footage or something like that. If you see the end of it at the very and I usually show you guys like the time lapse on my iPad, and some people do think it's like a 1-to-1. It is not. So I would appreciate if you guys stop thinking that maybe I'm trying to shorten the time or make it look like I'm drawing faster than I actually am. The amount of time spent on the drawing and the amount that is shown on the time lapse is not 1-to-1, so I'm not too sure how it actually speeds up, like what determines how fast it speeds up, but it's definitely not 1-to-1. Yeah, because I've had other drawings that maybe are like 10 hours long, but it's like a 13-minute time lapse if you just let it run freely. And then I have some other that's like kind of the opposite, so let's say it's like a 7-minute time lapse, but I've spent like 7.5 hours to 8 hours on it, so it's never 1-to-1. Rarely it is. So yeah, just wanted to clear that up first. But yeah, I'm wanting to draw Nahida, and to be honest, I wanted to draw her just because like I personally really like her design. Also like her from what we've seen of her skills and her ult and stuff, super pretty. I really like her aesthetic and stuff, so definitely wanted to draw her. Now I actually started the sketching portion and like a majority of the coloring too prior to her birthday, but once I figured out that it was her birthday, because that character teaser thing that said like happy birthday Nahida or something came out, I wanted to finish this for her birthday, so I finished it on the 27th. I think you guys are gonna see this on the 29th, maybe? Probably 29th, so it's been a couple of days, but for the most part I actually really like the drawing for different reasons. I think mostly because of the color palette and the fact that Nahida is just cute in general. So let's talk about the process a little bit. So I tried my best as usual to split the entire video into almost like 10-minute sessions for each part. So the first 10 minutes is me sketching, so it's just kind of like the shortened version. Like I said, I took about 5 hours drawing Nahida, so it took me a lot longer this time compared to some other sessions where it sticks around 3 to 4 hours. I did struggle a little bit with the posing. I also changed her face a couple of times, so I shrunk her face to be a little bit thinner and then sometimes a little bit shorter. I also moved her mouth a little bit, and then I will adjust her eyes in a little bit in like the coloring phase and when I actually merge the layers. So for the sketching, I already had an idea of what I wanted to do. I did very little thumbnailing in my sketchbook just to get a rough idea. I wasn't like really feeling the need to super flesh something out, if that makes sense. Like I already had like a mental image of what I already wanted, so I just wanted to do a little bit of browsing on potential color palettes or like any vibes that you want to kind of, or like atmosphere, I guess it might be a better term for your illustration. So I definitely wanted to lean towards some previous pieces that I've already done. I think Hito is one, and I think there's definitely another one. Maybe my Tignari piece on Ibis Paint, I think. So basically I wanted a more foliage focused piece with the light and stuff kind of streaming in, and we can kind of have the silhouette or the shadows of leaves above Nahida, as well as like the light peering through. So that's kind of what I initially wanted. I also wanted the idea of like, I think it's called komorebi. I think I talked about this before, but the scattering of the light and stuff for leaves. I do like that aesthetic a lot, so I wanted to incorporate that. So yeah, I wanted to draw her quite happy, quite very cute, kind of more free. And the reason why I have her hands out like this, I don't draw it until later because I knew I want it to be kind of like a separate part of the piece. I don't want it to be like overlapped on Nahida herself while I'm coloring. Therefore, like I want to be able to manipulate and move the piece around. So basically I want to put a dendro crystal fly kind of flying away from her, or like, you know, she's releasing it or something. So I had that planned, and that's what I initially wanted. I think in the end I go a little bit too ham with the effects and the colors, so we'll get onto that a little bit later. But for now I kind of have this up view, down view maybe? Down view of Nahida. So she's kind of looking up into the sky a little bit with her hands out. I did struggle a little bit with the hands. I think I've done 2 other pieces with similar hands, so I did a similar method of doing like the oval shapes. So at least we get fingers looking like fingers if they're kind of outstretched. I know like anatomically they're not probably super correct. I guess like, what is it called? The tips of her fingers are a little bit long. I know her hands might look a little bit big. I initially drew them like too big, but I did shrink it down a little bit. But because they're kind of coming towards you a little bit, I did want it to be a little bit bigger. I know she's more of like, not like chibi character, but she is like of the smaller model, so she does have really tiny hands, but I didn't draw it like that. So that's something I could have maybe tweaked a little bit before we actually started to color. I think because I haven't drawn Nahida before, I actually got a good look at her outfit. I did have to reference a few videos that people have posted of her kind of like walking around or turn around, because I needed to see what exactly was going on with the fabric on her back, because I believe on the official art I could not see exactly what the fabric looked like. I think it's because she's kind of like turned to the side, almost turning away from you, that it's kind of hard to see the one part of her body. So I did have to kind of think about that a little bit. Okay, on to coloring. So I duplicated my sketch, and then I decided to hide the second one as a safety or a backup, and then the original one I like to set it to multiply. I like to make the colors a lot warmer, and then we make a new layer under that and actually start with the background coloring. So it's going to be a little bit blown out for a bit, but I'm adding a very light yellowy green. I'm going to add a little bit of like indication of shadows of foliage, and we're kind of going from light to dark first because I thought it'd be easier for me to imagine. I believe this is what I did for Hiro as well, so I decided to do just bigger shapes and kind of blur it out a little bit later since it won't be in too much of focus. And then after I kind of have like all the shadows and majority of the darker colors that I want, I will add in an additional layer. Yes, an additional layer. Wait, what am I saying? An add layer. Let's say that. An add layer, so I can add brighter light coming from that side. So kind of like the upper left. And I kind of have it looking like scattered light. So I kind of blob it in and then take the eraser to kind of like chip away to make it look like kind of like it's in a conglomeration of different leaves and stuff, making the shapes rather than just like one gigantic blob. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I'm trying to add a bunch of different colors prior to blurring, just so we have a bunch of different hues and values. I think it looks pretty like this too, but like I said, I decided to add the add layer, and then I'm kind of chipping away a little bit so we can kind of get some leaf shapes and just different shapes kind of breaking into the shape, so we kind of have a scattering light effect. I almost never use the add layer at full opacity, so I lower it down. Another way is also to just use a darker color in the first place, but for me it's easier for me to imagine bright light as bright light, so I tend to use lighter colors. But Now we are working on shadows for the background. So because Nahida is looking up and I kind of want the light to look like it's shining from above her a little bit, I definitely wanted to have a little bit of darker shapes or shadows behind her, like on the ground. So that is what I did before we actually start to paint Nahida herself. So usually when I'm coloring, I like to start off with the face or the skin tone, just because usually it's a good chunk of the area, or like, you know, the focus point of my illustration, just because I love personally to, you know, draw and color and render the face the most. So whenever I'm starting off with the skin, I like to block it in with the base tone or the base color, and then I will try my best to kind of stay within the lines in terms of any lines that faces like the outside part of the character. Anything on the inside, I kind of leave it messy. You can kind of see that like near the top part of her hair. But as we gradually start to work on the skin, I actually will lock the layer, and then I will start to add the shadows and kind of like add a little bit more warmth to the skin. And as we further move along, I actually become a little bit more precise and a little bit cleaner with how I'm applying each color, just because when they end up actually doing the, what is it called? The rendering cleanup phase, I guess, I don't want to spend too much time fussing with the face. So the brush that I'm using right now, it's very much like just a round brush. It can give hard edges or soft edges depending on how much pressure you put. So a lot of the time I rely on the softer and kind of like the lighter opacity of the brush when pressing super lightly. But then if I want to have more sharp, cleaner edges, I will press quite hard. But because it is a round brush and it doesn't come towards like a nice point, it's best used, in my opinion, for larger areas. I do shrink it down quite a bit sometimes to get kind of like smaller edges, corners, and all that jazz. But for the most part, anything that needs more of a sharper edge or just like cleaner application, I will either use my sketching brush or the sharp render. I just personally find it easier to clean up with that brush. Just because like, one, it has a texture, so like it prevents me from wanting to move too large with the brush for areas, especially for the skin. I kind of like making the skin quite smooth, unless texture is like one of the goals for the skin that I need to kind of hit, you know, if it's like applicable to the character, whatever the scene is or anything like that, then I will use a texture brush. But for the most part, for skin, I like making it smooth. And then while I'm working on the rest of Nahida, so her hair, I believe it's more like a whitish gray, but I did lean it to a little bit more of a bluish green, and I'm kind of taking in consideration the background as well, which is what I've said before in other videos, that I like to do the background first because the environment affects the colors of the character and not the opposite way. So like, I'm not picking and choosing background character depending on the character if I'm drawing more of a scene. So I feel like you could probably do the opposite if you're doing like flat colors or something, because sometimes if you don't need the background to really stand out as much, you could also just put it at the end, especially if it's something more flat or less details. You could probably get away with it, but for the most part, I like having the background done first. I think it also helps me knock out whites areas, basically. I think it's also because like, I personally don't like working on a blinding white canvas, so initially, even before I start sketching, my canvas is already automatically kind of like that grayish tan color in the beginning. So I don't, yeah, it's just a personal preference. I don't like working on a white canvas. It just burns my eyes, and I draw at night a lot of the time, so yeah, just personal preference. For her dress, so similar to her hair, I like to pull colors from the background. So I pulled and mixed a little bit of the green into the white to kind of give my grayish greens into her dress, and then any of the peachy or brown tones either comes from her skin tone or the brown lines of the sketch itself. I think you guys already know how fond I am of kind of mixing cool and warm tones, especially for like white fabric or white objects. I think personally it looks a lot better to have varied colors instead of making it look quite flat by keeping the color fairly neutral or just like one hue, if that makes sense. I just don't like what it looks like usually, unless it's like purposeful and, you know, it's intentional. on like the consistency of the piece and stuff. But for me, I like to kind of throw in a little bit of different colors here and there if I deemed it fits. Because even like for her hair, I know it's not like 100% like white, because even in her illustration, I believe they use white for the highlights as well, which means that her hair is obviously not completely 100% like white, like the maximum whiteness of it, I guess, of like a bright white. So I decided to use white for the highlights going across her hair, but also in place of where it gets a little bit too lost, I did add a little like either shadow underneath for like kind of that hair texture, or I actually added a little bit of like greenish yellow, just kind of indicate a little bit where the highlight is. I've seen people do this in the past, and I understand why they do it and how they do it, but I just feel like because of how I work, I didn't make it match as nicely as I should. It kind of just seems like a thrown in color in the way like I placed it, but I think that's okay. I think similarly to the one I did of Candace, I actually really liked working on the gold detailings for Nahida. Anything of like kind of that metal material, it was quite fun, because anything that has kind of like that harsher edge was kind of nice to play around with the highlights and, you know, mix around some dull colors into the gold shadows and stuff. I think it's kind of fun. As well as like I got a good look at drawing Nahida's design a little bit. Now apologies if I'm repeating things I've already said. My editing program, I don't know if it's my editing program or my laptop, one of them is acting up and basically crashing. So either my laptop's just having a fussy day and it's crashing my editing program, or my editing program's being the usual butt it is and, you know, crashed multiple times, and I kind of lost 2 sessions of voice recording, so I do not remember what I've already said previously that is already kept in this voice recording versus ones that I've said but it's already been deleted. So yeah, I might have to look into that. I need to really switch editing programs soon so I can learn a new one, as well as not have this problem for the rest of my life. Let's see. Let me think. What else did I talk about? Not too sure. So color-wise, I tried my best just to reference the colors that she already had. I did lean them, I think, a little bit more on the cooler side for some of the greens. Just because personal preference, I like bluish greens the most. Some warm greens look nice, but I feel like sometimes some warm greens look like decaying, or you know, things that are about to, I guess, like more towards autumn, right? Like things are kind of decaying or dying, or just, you know, preparing for winter, basically. But I think also with the gold, the brighter greens look a little bit prettier, because when I was looking at her design, her gold pieces, at least in some areas, seem to be a lot duller. So usually when people color gold, some people make it like very vibrant, very poppy. Some people also make it a little bit more brassy, which I think I did compared to her official artwork. I also decided to add a little bit of greens and browns into the shadows, just because I think it's a little bit fun. Also in some areas of her dress, I decided to push the shadows a little bit more by adding more of a darker greenish gray, and then sometimes I lean it towards a little bit of purple. So for the sketch, so now that I've kind of done with the coloring for the most part, I am alpha locking my sketch, and this is where I start to paint over those lines and kind of change the colors to match certain areas. So I mainly do this for the bangs, where the hair kind of crosses into the face, as well as any of the skin, just to make things look a lot bit softer. Now obviously white areas as well, so like any lighter object, it's also good to change the sketch color if you like a softer look, unless you do want like more of a bold outline or something like that, or something a little bit more contrasting, then you can definitely do that. But for me, I like making things a little bit more lighter, and while I'm painting over certain places, I tend to darken things anyway, so for now I definitely prefer making them lighter, and then we can go darker later, because I think it's a little bit more difficult doing the opposite. So if I have a lot of light lines, or not light lines, if I have a lot of dark lines and I start to paint over with like lighter colors, sometimes the darker color pops through a little bit too much, or if I don't color it over one for one, there's definitely a lot of that color peeking through. But for lighter color with darker color on top, I get a little bit more leeway. So So for the edges, I'm making sure to erase anything that is not needed as well. So you could do that, or you can set it to white, so you can color white in, because white on multiply basically makes it disappear. Okay, so after I've done the general coloring and the changing of the sketch colors, I actually merged the two at this point, and I make a new layer. I set it to multiply and layer clipped it to my merged piece. So I'm actually adding in kind of like the little silhouette and shadows of the leaves kind of being on top of her basically. So we kind of have her look like leaves are above with the light peering through. So I'm doing the same thing what I did as the background, making the shadow shapes. I also locked the layer, and then I'm trying to mess around with the color of the shadows, which I like best. So around some of the edges I made it a lot warmer, and then as we move away from the edges I made it a little bit more bluish purple, just because I think the more closer it is to the light peering through, it's obviously going to be lighter or warmer. And then I'm doing the same thing as I did before, where I make an add layer on top. I layer clipped it as... Did I layer clip it? Yes, I layer clipped it because I only want it to be placed on Nahida herself. And then I am going to blur the little shapes, so it kind of looks like the scattering light going through the leaves. It just kind of helps intensify that a little bit more compared to just doing the shadows, and I think it looks a little bit prettier. So that is what I want the lighting generally to look like for this piece. I am going to add as well as a little bit of indication of like foliage in front or above her, so that the shadows kind of make a little bit more sense. So for the most part, I want Nahida to be in the focus. I am gonna add a Dendrocrystophyte like I mentioned in the beginning, but for the most part all these other elements I am going to just blur, but I need to add a certain level of detail before I blur it, otherwise it doesn't really read as foliage. Now, to be honest, I don't think I ever add enough detail for it to read nicely, but sometimes generic shapes will work, but in the future I would like to spend a little bit more time. Just not too much time, otherwise I'd feel bad about blurring it. So add a little bit of light, a little bit of shadows, ended up blurring it, and I went back to the shadow shape that I had on Nahida's head along with the highlights, and I decided to kind of distort it a little bit so that it wouldn't cover a whole chunk of her crown of her head basically. But yeah, I turned off all the above layers, so I turned off the multiply, the addition, as well as the foreground leaves off, so that we can focus on just rendering Nahida. So at this point I'm painting on the same layer as the merged layers, and I switched to the sharp render brush just because, like I said, I like having that sharper edge whenever I'm doing cleanup or doing detailing, just because it gives me a nice crisp sharp edge. So that is what I'm looking for. In terms of Genshin, I feel like there's been so many like leaks lately. Probably won't talk about them, but hopefully by the time you guys see this video, you're very pumped for the next update that's happening on, I think, Monday, Tuesday for people. I know it's Tuesday for me, so it's Monday for some of y'all. Let me think. But yeah, I think if you guys are summoning this patch, I wish you guys luck, because I have Monday's video, but I think Monday's video is going to be Inktober related still, since that's the last day of it, like October. But hopefully you guys will have good pulls, or if you're just saving up, I hope there's lots of primos that you can save up. I personally don't have a lot of primos saved up for Nahida, because I did end up trying to get Nilou earlier, but because I didn't get Nilou, I still potentially could get Nahida. I'm also not guaranteed, so I'm a little worried, but the pity is okay. I think I'm in the 60s, so yeah, I think I have enough for 3 10 shots currently, so not a lot. I can probably only get 1 guaranteed 5-star for the most part. We'll see. My luck's been okay in Genshin. I feel like I just jinxed myself, knock on wood. Yeah, I don't know what else to talk about in terms of Genshin. I've been kind of putting off a few of the world quests, so I should probably get to that this weekend. I am hopefully not coming down with a cold. I'm trying my best not to breathe too heavily into the mic at the moment. At the time of recording this part, because I did the second session with the effects, I think. No, actually I think it's just the cleanup and rendering and like After Effects and stuff that I did as the second session. So this session actually had a terrible time because my sinuses are still running a little wild right now, and I'm not too sure if it's just because like change in temperature. So where I live, I think it's last weekend, literally a week ago, we got snow, and it was quite a bit of snow actually for our province, in terms of just one day or just a couple of hours. It was actually quite a bit, and it kind of snowed overnight, which is not the greatest. But then the weather started to warm up, so it's not been too bad weather-wise, but the fluctuation of temperature definitely does a number to my body. My immune system, I think, is kind of on the weaker side. Especially like for temperature stuff, I think I'm quite weak. I think everything else, like, actually I'm okay. Like, I'm not too weak physically, I don't think, but usually being sick, I get sick quite often. I think it just barely hits, not barely hits me, it just doesn't hit me as hard as for some people. Like, I have a friend who gets sick probably once every 2 to 3 years, and then she gets sick like really badly to the point where like her voice is shot completely. She's like super feverish and all that jazz. I remember in uni taking care of her sometimes because she'd be stuck in her dorms and she's like, can you buy me honey and bread? And I'm like, absolutely. Just wait for me after class because I will come and deliver that for you. But for me, it's like I get sick quite often, just never super hard hitting. It just usually lasts like maybe 2 to 3 days. I feel like I never have anything to talk about when it comes to the cleaning and rendering phase, because I think for the most part, because rendering is not a technique that's like specific, there's less for me to talk about, because a lot of it is literally me just replacing colors, or like shifting colors around, picking up new colors that are surrounding, or adding like the line work or the sketch back in so that we can redefine the shape. It's just kind of just making things a little bit more clear, in my opinion, or trying to get rid of those sketchy lines. And for the most part, like I talked about this in the past a lot of my brushes that I like to use never have blending usually, just because I don't like the idea of muddying up colors and pushing them not by will, if that makes sense. I'm poor at using them. That's probably a better way of saying it. I know plenty of artists who use it super well. So yeah, it's just personal preference, and I think it's because I am more of a traditional artist as well, and not exactly like a painter. I'm more like a dry medium artist, if that makes sense. So things like graphite, colored pencils, pastels, Conte, charcoal were all like things I personally think, like, I was a little bit more, what is it called? Why am I blanking on words right now? Efficient, maybe? I don't know. But basically because I mostly kind of just build up value, and sometimes people use like what is it called? The blending stumps, or the chamois. I think it's called the chamois. I think it's a chamois. We call it the chamois. I'm not too sure, but people might use it to blend, or people use their fingers and stuff. I personally just like making things look smooth by slowly and lightly building up the tone, especially like when I was working, like, wow, I'm really slurring my words, working with lithography, like, not lithography, why am I saying it? Lithography. I don't know why I said it like that. So when I was in a lithography class, so I think in printmaking, so the first half of printmaking you do, is it etching? I think it's etching first. It depends on which side of the class you are. We usually have 2 groups going at the same time. So one group is doing etching on one side of the printmaking studio, and then the other one's doing lithography. So I was the part of the group that did etching first. Basically you have like, is it copper plates? I think we use copper plates. Copper plates, you use acid and different needles or like scraping tools and stuff, and basically etching into metal plates or letting the acid etch into the plate. Very fun. I think etching was actually my favorite, but in terms of like style and application, lithography fit my drawing style the best because I have such strong affinity for pencil drawing, or just like dry medium drawing, in a way that I think a lot of people enjoy like smoother or like pencil like you like the texture of the material that you're working with. So there was a couple of us who really like lithography because it can imitate the different like not charcoal pencils, I forget the medium lithography pencil. There's like a thing for the pencil. It basically has kind of like an oil that is it repels or attracts the acid. I think it's like it accepts the acid, so it like basically burns into like the stone. I think if you look up lithography, you can look up like the litho stones or whatever it's called. Oh, can you guys hear the wind, by the way? I'll stay quiet for a little bit in a bit so you guys can hear the wind. Oof, I can see it shaking my desk. But yeah, I usually never have problem usually with the shaking because the camera is not attached to my desk, it's attached to the shelf, and my shelf and my desk are not touching. So I knew that the wind was super strong, and it's been like that for the last like couple of days. Oh, that's what I was talking about earlier actually, now that I'm on more like a rambling streak. My body's like been having a hard time adjusting to the temperature, and it's kind of getting to that point where I can't tell if the wind is warm wind or cool wind. But the last few days were actually quite warm, and I went out the last few days, so I can't tell if I got sick just because the weather is a lot warmer after being cold for quite a while. But then at night it's super cold. Even right now I have my blanket and a hoodie on, so oh yeah, for the gold detailing that you saw me do just a little bit like a few seconds ago, I did do that on a multiply layer so that I didn't have to worry about going over the shadow parts of her fabric. I am now turning on back the different effects so we can kind of see, as well as the foreground leaves, and I noticed that I wanted to adjust a few things. I thought the shadows on her is a little bit too strong, so I wanted to change the brightness of it as well as kind of push the saturation, because I make things maybe a little bit overly saturated at times. I personally really like it, but I know it's not like effective all the time. Yeah, and I kind of played around with effects quite a lot. Ooh, don't know why I sighed there. I'm assuming it's because of my sinuses that I'm probably struggling. I decided to add like petals or like little things of light. I will kind of make them a little bit more dull in the end because I don't want the colors to be too jarring. I added the smaller ones with motion blur and the larger ones kind of just faded. And here I'm adding the crystal fly. So I am going to duplicate this crystal fly after so you can make one in the upper right hand corner. But for the most part, just follow the reference, adjust what I need because I want it to be facing a certain way. Yeah, so just drew the crystal core, draw the wings, duplicate one wing, shrink it, distort it, plop it onto the other side so it looks like it's receding just a tiny bit. And then I set the sketch to multiply like I usually do, give it a little color, and then I will alpha lock the color of that green, add in kind of different greens to match whatever the color is, add a little bit yellow towards the center, and then we can do a little bit of the design. So this is like one of those things I wanted to draw with enough detail so that people knew what it was, but because I'm going to be blurring it as I want it to look like it's moving or going further away from Nahida, I am not going to spend too much time cleaning it up or anything, so just wanted to have things in the proper places. I'm also going to change the color a little bit because I am going to add another add layer to add more luminosity. So that is what I'm doing here to make it look like it's glowing. I will duplicate both of these layers and add it to the top right hand corner. I'll add some speckles, and I think that's pretty much it for this piece. Here's the second one, by the way. I will distort it a little bit. I made it a little bit bigger as well, so we kind of have the perspective a little bit more correct, or at least it looks like it's getting larger as it's flying upwards. Speckles, just because I think crystal flies kind of had like the little fairy dust kind of things around it, or anything like that. Either that's kind of like looks like light scattering maybe. Last but not least, one last blend mode. Make a new layer on top of everything. I will set it to overlay, and then I will start to place down colors which I think will look nicely for each place. So I'm adding more of a dark ultramarine-ish color to the edges where the shadows are, kind of a warmer purple for her face, kind of oranges near the light where the sun is, and then I will lower the opacity. I'm gonna lower the opacity twice because I definitely think the shadows look a little bit too saturated, but I think that's okay. It's not too bad, so I'll just have to lower it a little bit more. Like I said, blend modes, I like to lower the opacity as much as I can. And here's the time lapse. This is what I was talking about. So at the end of the time lapse with the little time in the right hand corner, you'll see that I think it says it takes 7 minutes for the time lapse, and it's not a 1-to-1. So yeah, I definitely took, I think 5.5 hours ish, if not 5 hours and 40 minutes or something on this piece. So yeah, not a 1-to-1. Just wanted to let you know that I'm not lying about the amount of time I spent on the piece. I did split it between 2 days, so yeah, but that is basically it. Oh, I'm lowering the opacity once more. I think I adjusted it a little bit differently too for the last part. But hopefully you guys enjoyed today's video, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye!